the space that's available. Sometimes plants just have their seasons. You know, they don't look good 24/7, 365 days of the year. And I would put Coreopsis gigantea into that category. It's a really beautiful plant when it leaves out and when it's in flower. It's just stunning. Here's a huge natural planting of it down in Point Dume in the Malibu area on the left. And on the right, I think that this gardener did a really, I think, clever job of combining it with some bold textured succulents, and I believe that's a senecio in the foreground, the silver shrub. So when the Coreopsis gets to its shaggy dog stage, when the leaves all shrivel up and hang down with their brown, dried, shriveled foliage against the trunk, which some people would find objectionable, your eye will be drawn to its partners instead. Of course, proper spacing is crucial if you're trying to achieve minimal amount of maintenance in a garden. We tend to want instant gratification and plant things way too close together, and of course we get into trouble with that because the plants will outgrow one another or create undue amounts of green waste that just end up either going to the landfill. And even if your municipality is recycling green waste, you still have all those trucking costs. Somebody has to prune it, it goes into a truck, goes out to the green waste site, and eventually does turn around and become compost or mulch and come back out into the landscape, but still there are costs associated with that. And somewhere in here, I actually have a quote from Nevin, who, as we know, was not able to join us today. This is from his wonderful book, Native Treasures. One of the great sins of commercial landscaping is deliberate overplanting for immediate effect. This is not necessarily an indictment of landscapers, but more often of their impatient clients. Its earliest effect is simple overcrowding of plants. Then low shrubs begin to rear up like frightened horses. I like that analogy. Smothered lower branches defoliate and die prematurely. Where moisture is retained between leaves and branches, fungal diseases will set in, sometimes destroying large branches or even whole plants. At best, many plants may have to be removed with considerable effort, leaving the landscape scarred for some time. So, proper spacing. And that's part of the garden process, of course, just watching things grow. Here, a fairly young garden that was on the Theodore Payne Foundation tour. I think this was last year. This homeowner, who happens to be, I think, a designer as well, gave her barberries. I'm not sure which species this is, if it's Berberis aquifolium or Pineda, but she planted them fairly generous spacing so that they would be able to grow in and create a nice informal hedge in time without overwhelming one another. Of course, we've heard a lot of talk over the past few years about lawns in California, the inappropriateness of lawns, and there's a whole book on that subject that Bart and Dave and I recently finished up and is actually at the printer, so that'll be out in another month or so. You don't necessarily have to completely get rid of it. Reducing the size can be one step toward maybe total elimination. This is actually the native lawn at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden. But I myself question what the benefit of having a native lawn is if you're mowing it and watering it the same amount as if it was a non-native lawn. So to consider the inputs as well as the outputs here. What about something like a Bouteloua lawn, blue grama, and maybe not mowing it quite as often, or don't mow it at all, except perhaps once a year, just to cut back the brown leaves when it gets into its dormant stage. Not only is that less work for you, but provides a little bit more benefit in terms of wildlife. Lots of alternatives to traditional lawns seem to be showing up more and more in nurseries. That's another example of blue grama in the back, on the upper left. And the lower right, just no lawn at all. If you're not using your lawn for a playing surface, for entertainment purposes. Perhaps you really don't need something that you have to walk on, and there's just a tremendous number of low-growing, moisture conserving, low water using plants. And in this example, there's Ceanothus maritimus and Lysyngia silver carpet, and a little bit taller in the background is one of the purple sages. Limiting your plant palette, which Bernard is just such an artist at doing, helps to cut down on the overall maintenance requirements of your landscape as well. The fewer plants that you have to attend to, the easier it is to figure out your overall maintenance program. And simple can be beautiful, as you can see in this garden here, which is composed of just a handful of plants, mostly canyon snow iris. I believe this is beach strawberry, but I don't remember for sure. And one of the cultivars of Juncus patens, with a coast live oak in the background. For those of us who really love plants and can't help ourselves, we might do something a little bit more exuberant and diverse. This is part of the meadow planting at the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden on the upper right, which is, let's see what's here. There's sages and verbenas and blue-eyed grass and poppies and penstemons and some native sedge. In the lower right, most of the plants in the foreground are California natives above these attractive sandstone retaining walls. But this is actually on the way to the vegetable garden, private residence in Santa Barbara, and so she has you can see some of the lattice work in the background, which is used to train some of her food plants. And there's an herb garden here as well, with lavender. So it's a nice, actually I think a very appealing combination, but there's a lot going on here, and it takes a fair amount of maintenance, even though it is pretty water thrifty. Limiting the use of plants that maybe actually need grooming. Not everything, like the coreopsis that I showed before, looks good all year round. I think we probably all love monkey flowers, but they have their period of the year when the drying capsules and the dead leaves on the lower branches of the plant aren't all that appealing, and so they do benefit from being cut back. The same is true of Zauschneria. Bart mentioned that he cuts most of the cultivars and species that they plant at Rancho back on an annual basis, down to 1 or 2 inches tall. And not only does that tidy up the plant, but it, I think, promotes better blooming the following year. But if you just don't want to have to do that, then these are plants that you probably might consider leaving out of your garden or limiting the quantity of them in the landscape. Another plant that we use a lot around Santa Barbara and native gardens is canyon sunflower. These plants that are surrounding me on the image on the right, I took this from a recent hike on one of the foothill trails in Santa Barbara that had been burned a couple of years ago, and these plants are taller than me. I'm 5'6", and some of those are easily 6 feet tall. But you can see, I think you can see, these are all the dead leaves from last year hanging on. And had these plants been cut back, they would look more like this plant, nice, rounded, very leafy, and more floriferous as well. So canyon sunflower, or Venegasia, I think is another one of our native plants that benefits from periodic pruning. The same is true of purple sage, or lots of our sages. They reward us with incredibly copious, beautiful displays of flowers, but if you get tired eventually of the dried inflorescences after they've started to shatter or drop their seeds, and if you never prune them, the plants themselves will start to get woody and thin and expose more of their bare branches, such as this colony on the top. So periodically pruning them back will reward you with more leafy and more floriferous plants eventually. And ideally, it's best to do that on an annual basis, at least tip pruning them so that they don't get too woody too soon. On the other end of the scale, there are certain plants that just almost never need any kind of attention. And if you're a lazy gardener, and you really don't want to spend a whole lot of time, or you don't want to pay somebody a lot of time and money, then things like our native yucca whipplei, or Hespero yucca, you wouldn't want to get too close to this one anyway. And manzanitas. Everyone has extolled the virtues of manzanitas this afternoon and this morning. And other than taking off dead branches, really, what do you need to do to a manzanita except step back and admire it? They're just so beautiful all year round. I probably didn't even need to include this because those of you who are members of CNPS are very well aware of the incredible damage that invasive plants have had on our natural landscape. Depending on which paper you read, the loss of the threats to the natural landscape, not just in California but across the country, besides habitat destruction, invasive pests are considered to be the second most damaging cause. And a lot of those plants, unfortunately, were deliberately introduced for their ornamental value, and they've just escaped, such as the Genista on the left-hand photograph, and a really beautiful tree, but the California pepper, which of course is not from California, Shinus Molly. Some kind of justice in it being confined to this pen and this, I can't remember which mission this is. I don't remember where I got that picture. So, notice the definition of the ideal plant. I mean, it can turn out to be, the perfect weed, so we have to choose carefully what we decide to bring into our landscapes and how we use them so that they don't become threats down the road. There are a couple of other quotes from landscape designers that speak to this issue of plant selection that I just want to make a point of not forgetting to share with you. One is by Nan Fairbrother, who is a landscape architect, and I'm sorry I don't remember the name of the book, but maybe Bernard does, that was written many, many years ago, and it's back in print again, so if anybody's interested, ask me later and I'll try to remember to get the source for you. But there are a couple quotes of hers I think are just jewels. At the design stage, the choice of plants is unimportant, except that they serve as material for the composition. A collection of choice plants is not a landscape any more than a list of choice words is a poem. That's kind of hard to live by for those of us who love plants, but I think there's a lot of truth to that. And then this other one by her about flowers. Flowers are the last and least important class of vegetation for design, even though millions of contented gardeners consider them the essential raison d'etre of the whole process. Just as architects are concerned with the structure of buildings, so landscape designers are concerned with the structure of landscape. When considering the overall design, flowers are largely irrelevant, for we can no more make a good garden by starting with flowers than a house by starting with the ornaments on the shelves. So, back to plant selection, just a few more landscape ornamentals that actually have become invasive. Echium is a real problem, I know, along the Big Sur coast, and it is starting to become a weed in Santa Barbara as well. Just in the almost 30 years that I've lived in Santa Barbara, I've noticed that it is popping up throughout Oak Woodland and Chaparral in Southern California when it didn't used to. And unfortunately, even native plants can become invasive. Many of you are aware of Lupinus arboreus being planted outside of its natural range and now invading the habitat of is it Lupinus chamosonis or albifrons? Bart, I'm looking to you. Anyway, it is getting out of control.